The request came through Marcus Richardson, Maduro's attorney, 3 months into his detention at MDC Brooklyn. A production company working with Netflix wanted to film a documentary about his case. They were calling it Maduro the Fall, and planned to explore how a bus driver's son became president of Venezuela, and then ended up in an American prison facing life sentences for drug trafficking. The producers wanted interviews with Maduro himself, his family, former government officials, victims of his regime, and legal experts. They promised editorial independence and claimed they wanted to tell a balanced story. Richardson was skeptical, but presented the offer during one of their weekly meetings in the attorney conference room. They're offering $20,000 to your legal defense fund in exchange for 3 hours of interview time. That's not nothing, Mr. Maduro. We could use those resources for investigation and expert witnesses. Maduro sat across from his attorney, wearing the same khaki prison uniform he'd worn every day for months, and considered the proposition. His first instinct was to refuse. Why would he cooperate with people who would inevitably portray him as a monster? Why give ammunition to those who wanted to destroy whatever remained of his reputation? But then again, what reputation remained to protect? The evidence presented at his arraignment had already demolished any pretense of innocence. The world knew he was guilty. Maybe this was an opportunity to explain himself, to provide context that courtroom testimony couldn't capture, to be seen as a human being rather than just a criminal. What editorial control would I have? Maduro asked. None, Richardson said bluntly. They make that very clear. You can speak your truth, but they'll edit it however they want. They could make you look sympathetic or make you look even worse. You have no guarantee about how you'll be portrayed. Then why would I agree? Because your story will be told whether you participate or not. At least this way, your voice is part of the narrative. At least people hear directly from you rather than just from your enemies and critics. And frankly, the money would help your defense significantly. Maduro thought about it for several days. He consulted with Rodriguez, his cellmate, who had surprisingly strong opinions about media strategy. Do it, Rodriguez said. But be smart about it. Don't lie, because they'll fact-check everything. Don't make excuses, because people hate that. Just tell your story honestly, and let people judge for themselves. You might be surprised. Some people will still hate you, but others might understand that you're more complicated than just evil dictator. Why do you care whether I do this documentary? Because I watch a lot of Netflix in here, and I'm tired of documentaries that are one-sided hit pieces. If you're actually willing to be honest about what you did and why, that could be interesting. That could be something worth watching. 2 weeks later, Maduro signed the consent forms. The documentary crew was scheduled to arrive on a Tuesday morning in late April. They'd have 3 hours with him in a specially designated room where filming was permitted. No topics were off limits. No questions were pre-approved. Whatever they asked, Maduro would have to answer or explicitly refuse to answer on camera. The night before the interview, Maduro couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk rehearsing possible questions and answers, trying to prepare for an experience he'd never had before. In Venezuela, he'd given hundreds of interviews, but always with friendly journalists, always with questions submitted in advance, always with the ability to end the interview if things got uncomfortable. This would be different. These filmmakers had no loyalty to him, no political agenda beyond creating compelling content. They would ask the questions that made him squirm because those were the questions that made good television. Rodriguez offered advice from the bunk below. Remember, they want emotion. They want you to cry or get angry, or show some kind of strong feeling. If you're too controlled, too political, it'll be boring and they'll edit around you. But if you're too emotional, too broken, you look weak. Find the middle. Be human but maintain dignity. How do you know so much about this? I watch a lot of true crime documentaries, man. I know how they work. They build narrative through selective editing. They create heroes and villains. You're already the villain in most people's minds. So your job is to add complexity, make people think. Okay, he did terrible things, but I understand why he thought those choices made sense. That's the best you can hope for. The documentary crew arrived at 9 a.m. There were 5 of them, a director, a cinematographer, a sound engineer, and 2 producers. They'd been granted access to a large conference room normally used for attorney meetings. The room had been transformed with professional lighting equipment, multiple cameras, and a simple interview setup with 2 chairs facing each other. Maduro was escorted into the room by 2 guards, who took positions by the door. He'd been allowed to shower that morning and had been given a clean prison uniform, but there was no hiding what he'd become. 3 months of institutional food and stress had changed his appearance. He'd lost weight but gained years. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, his eyes more hollow. The director was a woman in her 40s named Sarah Chen. She'd made several acclaimed documentaries about political figures and had a reputation for tough but fair questioning. She shook Maduro's hand, the first woman besides guards to touch him in months, and guided him to one of the interview chairs. "Thank you for agreeing to this," Chen said as the crew made final adjustments to cameras and lighting. "I want to be upfront about my approach. I'm going to ask difficult questions. Some of them will be uncomfortable. You can refuse to answer anything, but I'd encourage you to be as honest as possible. People respond to authenticity, even when the truth is ugly." "I understand," Maduro said, his voice rougher than he'd expected. "How does this work?" "I'll ask questions, you answer. Try to ignore the cameras. Just talk to me like we're having a conversation. The crew will stay quiet unless there's a technical issue. We'll film for about 3 hours with a few short breaks. After each segment, I'll give you a few minutes to collect yourself if needed. Ready?" Maduro nodded. A production assistant held up a clapperboard, snapped it, and Chen began. "Let's start at the beginning. You're Nicolás Maduro, former president of Venezuela, currently detained in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, awaiting trial on narco-terrorism charges. How do you want people to remember you?" The question was so broad, so open, that Maduro almost laughed. How did he want to be remembered? As a leader who tried to continue Chávez's revolution, as a failure who destroyed his country, as a criminal who facilitated drug trafficking, as a human being who made choices in impossible circumstances. "I want people to remember that I tried," he said finally. "I tried to hold Venezuela together when everything was falling apart. I tried to protect the revolution that Hugo Chávez built. I tried to resist American imperialism and economic warfare. Did I succeed? Obviously not. I'm sitting in an American prison, and Venezuela is in ruins. But I tried." Chen leaned forward slightly. "Let's talk about those tries. The prosecution has played recordings of you discussing drug shipments with cartel leaders. They have financial records showing hundreds of millions of dollars moving through accounts you controlled. They have witnesses testifying about your personal involvement in narcotics trafficking. Were you trying to hold Venezuela together? Or were you enriching yourself through criminal enterprise?" There it was, the core question. The accusation that Maduro had been preparing to answer for months. "Both," he said, and saw Chen's eyebrows rise slightly. "Both? Yes. The money from facilitating cartel operations went into government accounts that funded social programs, military salaries, basic government operations. When oil prices collapsed and American sanctions cut off traditional revenue sources, we needed money from somewhere. The cartels were willing to pay for access to Venezuelan territory and protection from law enforcement. That money kept the government functioning. It also made you personally wealthy. Swiss bank accounts, real estate in the Caribbean, shell companies. Some of that money was for personal security." "Yes," Maduro interrupted. "Do you know what it's like to be a head of state targeted by the most powerful country in the world? I needed resources outside Venezuela in case I had to flee. I needed accounts that American sanctions couldn't touch. Was some of it excessive? Probably. Did I live better than most Venezuelans? Yes. But I wasn't stealing from the people. I was trying to survive in a situation where everyone wanted me dead or imprisoned." Chen let that answer sit for a moment before continuing. "Let's talk about the people. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country during your presidency. Hyperinflation destroyed the economy. People starved while you lived in a palace. How do you justify that?" Maduro felt anger rising but forced himself to stay calm. "I can't justify it. The suffering was real. The economic collapse was catastrophic. But you have to understand the context. American sanctions deliberately targeted Venezuela's economy. They wanted to create suffering to turn people against my government. They succeeded. But blaming me for all of that suffering while ignoring American economic warfare is dishonest. So the suffering was America's fault, not yours. It was both. I made mistakes. I appointed corrupt officials who stole money that should have gone to the people. I maintained policies that didn't work because I was too stubborn to admit they'd failed. I prioritized keeping power over improving people's lives. Those are my failures. But American sanctions accelerated and amplified every problem. If you're going to tell this story, tell the whole story. Chen nodded, making a note. Fair enough. Let's talk about specific decisions. The recordings played in court show you personally authorizing military protection for drug shipments. Can you walk me through that decision-making process? How does a president decide to facilitate narcotics trafficking? This was the question Maduro had been dreading, the one that required him to explain the inexplicable. It happened gradually, he said slowly. First, it was just looking the other way. The military reported cartel activity in border regions, and I authorized them to focus on other priorities. Then it was more active, scheduling patrols to avoid certain areas at certain times. Then it was direct coordination. At each step I told myself it was temporary, just until the economic situation improved. But it never improved. The involvement just got deeper. Did you ever consider that you were helping poison communities, that Venezuelan cocaine was killing people in the United States, in Europe, everywhere these drugs ended up? I considered it, Maduro said quietly. But I rationalized it. I told myself that if Venezuelans didn't facilitate the drug trade, someone else would. That the cartels would operate with or without us. So we might as well benefit financially. I told myself that American demand for drugs was the real problem, not Venezuelan supply. I told myself a lot of things that let me sleep at night. But they were lies. I knew what we were doing was wrong. I did it anyway because I was desperate. Chen studied him for a long moment. That's the most honest answer I've heard from you. Why? Why be honest now? Because lying doesn't work anymore. The evidence is overwhelming. Everyone knows what I did. The only thing I can control now is how I explain why. And maybe if I'm honest about the rationalizations and the lies I told myself, other leaders will recognize those patterns in their own decision-making. Maybe it prevents someone else from going down the same path. They took a 5-minute break. Maduro drank water and tried to calm his racing heart. The interview was harder than he'd expected. Chen's questions were sharp but fair, and he found himself saying things he'd never admitted before, not even to himself. When they resumed, Chen shifted topics. Let's talk about your wife, Cilia Flores. She's cooperating with prosecutors and will testify against you. How does that feel? The question was like a knife. Maduro's carefully maintained composure cracked. How do you think it feels? We were married for 32 years. We built everything together. And she's going to sit in a courtroom and tell a jury about my crimes so she can reduce her sentence. It feels like betrayal. It feels like everything we had was a lie. Do you blame her? Yes and no. She made a rational decision to save herself. I would have done the same if our positions were reversed. But it still hurts. It still feels like the ultimate abandonment. You say you would have done the same, but when you were offered cooperation deals, you refused multiple times. Why? Maduro thought about how to explain the complex mixture of pride, principle, and stubbornness that had driven his refusals. Because I'm already guilty. The evidence against me is overwhelming. Cooperating wouldn't change the outcome significantly, but cooperating would require me to betray everyone who trusted me, everyone who worked for me, everyone who believed in what we were trying to build. I couldn't do that. It's probably stupid, probably prideful, but I couldn't become an informant, even if it meant spending the rest of your life in prison. Even then, Chen made another note. Let's talk about your legacy. What do you think history will say about Nicolás Maduro? That I was a failure? Maduro said immediately. That I inherited a revolutionary movement and destroyed it through incompetence and corruption. That I oversaw the economic collapse of one of the richest countries in Latin America. That I facilitated drug trafficking and enriched myself while my people suffered. History won't be kind. Do you deserve kindness from history? The question hung in the air. Maduro thought about everything that had happened, the suffering he'd caused, the lives destroyed, the country left in ruins. No, he said finally. I don't deserve kindness. I deserve to be remembered as a cautionary tale, a leader who started with good intentions and ended up as a criminal, someone whose story might prevent others from making the same mistakes. They continued for another 2 hours. Chen asked about specific decisions, specific incidents, specific people. She showed him photographs of Venezuelans who had fled the country, asked him to respond to their stories of suffering. She played audio clips from victims of violence that occurred under his government and asked him to account for each one. By the end, Maduro was exhausted, emotionally drained. He'd admitted things he'd never said aloud. He'd confronted failures he'd spent years avoiding. He'd looked directly at the human cost of his decisions in a way he'd never allowed himself to do while in power. The final question came as the crew was packing up equipment. One last thing, Chen said. If you could speak directly to the Venezuelan people right now, what would you say? Maduro looked directly at the camera for the first time. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the suffering. I'm sorry for the failures. I'm sorry for betraying the trust you placed in me. I thought I was fighting for the revolution, for the poor, for Venezuelan sovereignty. But I was really just fighting to keep power. And in that fight I destroyed everything I claimed to be protecting. I'm sorry. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's all I have left to offer. Chen signaled to cut. The interview was over. As the guards prepared to escort him back to his cell, Chen approached him one final time. Thank you for being honest. I know that wasn't easy. Will you use all of it? All the admissions? I'll use what serves the story. Some of it will make you look more sympathetic. Some of it will make you look worse. But yes, I'll use the honest moments. Those are the most valuable. Maduro nodded. When will this air? We're aiming for release in about 6 months. Probably around the time your trial starts. It'll generate a lot of attention. You should prepare for that. Back in his cell, Rodriguez asked how it went. I told them everything. Maduro said. All of it. The drugs, the corruption, the rationalizations, everything. How do you feel? Like I just confessed to the whole world. Like I stripped away every defense and just admitted that I'm everything they say I am. That took guts. Or stupidity. I won't know which until the documentary airs, and I see how they edited it. 6 months later, the documentary premiered on Netflix. Maduro wasn't allowed to watch it. Inmates didn't have Netflix access. But within hours, the reactions started flooding in through news reports and letters from family and supporters. The documentary had portrayed him exactly as he'd feared and hoped, not as a simple villain, but as a complex, flawed human being who had made terrible choices. The most viral moment was the final question. His direct apology to the Venezuelan people. Millions watched him look into the camera with hollow eyes and admit his failures. Some viewers were moved. They saw a broken man accepting responsibility. But many more were enraged. They saw a criminal trying to rehabilitate his image, playing for sympathy while facing justice. Venezuelan exile communities held watch parties where they shouted at the screen. Families of victims posted responses online calling his apology worthless. Political opponents used clips from the documentary to argue that his admissions proved premeditation and consciousness of guilt. But there was one moment that the documentary captured that Maduro hadn't even realized was being filmed. During one of the breaks, while the crew was adjusting equipment, a camera had kept rolling. It caught Maduro with his face in his hands, shoulders shaking, crying in a way he hadn't let himself cry during the actual interview. That 30-second clip became the most shared moment from the entire documentary. Some people saw it as genuine remorse. Others saw it as self-pity. But everyone saw it as human. A man stripped of power and dignity, confronting what he'd become. The documentary changed nothing about his legal situation. The trial proceeded as scheduled. The evidence was still overwhelming. The verdict was still inevitable. But it changed how some people saw him. Not many, not enough to matter in any practical sense. But some. And for Maduro, sitting in his cell reading letters from viewers, that was something. Not redemption. He didn't deserve redemption, but recognition that he was more complicated than a simple monster, that his story contained warnings about power and rationalization, and the gradual corruption of ideals. Sarah Chen sent him one final letter after the documentary aired. Your honesty made the film powerful. I hope you find some peace in knowing that you told your truth. Even when that truth was ugly. History will judge you harshly, but at least history will judge the real you, not just a caricature. Maduro read the letter several times before putting it away with his other possessions. The real him, a failed leader, a criminal, a man who had started with good intentions and ended up in prison. A cautionary tale. Maybe that was the best he could hope for. Not to be remembered fondly, but to be remembered honestly. To serve as a warning to future leaders about the paths not to take, the compromises not to make, the lines not to cross. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. And in prison, serving life, anything was better than nothing.